Hello, I'm back recording chapter 8 today in Irene Hunt's Across 5 Aprils. The autumn of 62 was grim. Looking back to the spring and early summer, Jethro realized that, although the early months had meant anxiety and fear for himself and his family, the cause of the Union had been going well in the West. He counted the federal victories beginning with Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, always to be associated in his memory with that last firelit evening he had spent with Shadrach. On to Pea Ridge, from which Mr. Roscoe's grandson had emerged unharmed, and to the Mississippi, where grim old Admiral Farragut had done the impossible and had taken over New Orleans, and where General Pope, bluster though he might be, was hailed as a hero after he had taken New Madrid and the powerful Confederate fort at Island No. 10. Jethro studied the map of the Mississippi carefully. Only a strip of the river between Baton Rouge and Vicksburg was then under Confederate control. "We're doing better than Chad allowed we would," he told Jenny. He measured the short strip on the map with his fingers. "Look, it's just a little piece of river. Once we take that, it's like Shad told me, the Confederacy will be cut in two." It was a very short strip as measured by his fingers, but a shadow swept across his eyes as he recalled Shadrach's words. Think how hard the fight was at this little dot on the map called Donelson. He thought of another dot, which was only peach orchards and an old church where Tom and thousands of others had died, a dot that seemed a hateful place to him. He would have to grow older and learn from history that the battle had been one of great importance for the Union, that the Confederate attempt to regain Western Tennessee had failed, and was therefore a bitter blow to the government of Jefferson Davis. But in 1862, Jethro hated to think of Shiloh, not only because of Tom, but because it seemed to him to have been an empty victory. The triumphs along the Mississippi had made good news, and hopes throughout the North were at a high peak when chilling word came up from Tennessee. There, two Confederate generals, Bragg and Smith, had driven the Federals out of the Cumberland Gap and were moving north to Kentucky, where they would surely reclaim that state if Don Carlos Buell couldn't stop them. Young Tom had helped to clinch Kentucky to the side of the Union at Donelson. Now Jethro read with a heavy heart that General Bragg was boasting of his intention to set up a Confederate governor of Kentucky. Equally chilling was the news from the East. General Pope, hero of Island No. 10, was no longer a hero in Virginia. At the end of August, just 13 months after the day when congressmen and their ladies had driven out to Bull Run for a day of picnicking and battle viewing, a second disaster for the Federals took place on the same spot. The Confederate generals were Lee and Stonewall Jackson, together with James Longstreet, who brought up reinforcements that saved the day for the Confederates. A good part of McClellan's army, as well as Pope's, the papers admitted, was disorganized and hopeless. Thus, the high hopes that had given comfort to the North during the spring were almost crushed by early fall. Faith in the leaders was at its lowest ebb. Criticism of the president poured in from all sides. Armies were demoralized and desertion began, first in a slow trickling, then in a flood as the months dragged on. Jethro read the news in dismay, and for the rest of the war, there was always a fear within him that disappointment and disaster inevitably followed hope. But work on the farm had to go on, although armies faltered and leaders fell in disgrace. Late in September, men from the nearby communities and from even as far away as Newton came to build a new barn, so that Matt Creighton's stock might have shelter before winter snow set in. There were 20 or more of them, with teams and loads of logs, with saws and axes, and a barrel of cider to give their work a spark of holiday spirit. Ross Milton came, and although he was too crippled to work, the men were pleased to have him with them, and Jethro was delighted. When he went out to greet the editor, Jethro noticed the young man who had cared for his team that day in Newton, now sitting on a high load of logs behind Ross Milton's buggy. Milton jerked his thumb toward the wagon as he climbed slowly down from his seat. Charlie is bringing that load of logs from a friend of yours, he told Jethro quietly. I can't think of anybody down your way that is a special friend of mine, Jethro said, puzzled. Dave Burdo, the editor answered. I'd asked him to come with us today. He wouldn't, but he came to town yesterday and asked me to have someone bring up this load of logs he'd cut. He said, tell the young one Dave Burdo is sending them to him. Jethro nodded. I allow to get thanks. He paused and flushed as he looked up at the editor. I want to send thanks to him, one way or the other. I've done it for you, Milton answered, smiling briefly at the evidence that his book had been read. Dave isn't used to thanks. They make him restless. But he's listened, and more than that, he's shaken several hands that have been extended to him since the two of you rode together through that stretch of woods road last March. I'm proud to hear it, Jethro said soberly. I thought you might be. Milton turned toward the porch, where Matt waited to speak to him, and Jethro went back to show Charlie where to place his wagon and Burdo's gift. By noon, Ellen, with the help of Nancy and Jenny, had spread a long table out under the silver poplars in the dooryard. And here the men ate roasted meats and potatoes, vegetables preserved from the summer garden, baked beans, and cornbread spread thickly with freshly churned butter. They had autumn peaches picked from the trees and sliced in golden cream, mounds of wild honey, and apples that Nancy's little boys had polished until they looked rosily against the white cloth. The season of plenty in southern Illinois had not been touched by the war. There might have been no war at all for an hour or so, as the men ate and joked in the mellow sunlight of the dooryard. But during the afternoon, as he carried water and ran a dozen different errands, Jethro heard them talking of a battle in the east. It was at a place he had not quite known how to pronounce when he had read of it in the papers. Antietam. Well, McClellan moved, Israel Thomas was saying. You have to say that for him. He finally moved. Old Abe give him another chance. Maybe now he'll get down to fighting, if that ain't asking too much of such a fine-haired general. Ed Turner's face was full of disgust as he strained to lift the log into place. Him get down to fighting? Don't ever think of it. He wants to strut around and brag and look handsome, but he don't want to fight, not him. I reckon old Abe was right. The Army of the Potomac is Mr. McClellan's bodyguard. Well, he drove Bobby Lee out of Maryland the other day, another man remarked. That much is to his credit. And if Bobby Lee had drove McClellan out, he'd have followed up and pestered that army that was in retreat. But not McClellan. No, he wastes thousands of boys, then he sits back and rests, waiting for them that's left living to cheer him big. Ed Turner wiped the sweat from his eyes with an angry gesture. I got no use for McClellan. I don't know what old Abe means. Tuckered to him like he was some little sawed-off king. Then Tom Marin from Rosehill spoke up. If you ask my opinion of McClellan, I'll tell you I don't think he wants to win. I don't think he's ever really going to move in on the Rebs because their way of thinking is his way of thinking. Oh, I reckon he ain't that low. Old Abe must not be quite that poor in picking his head men, Israel Thomas objected. Maybe old Abe ain't losing his breath to lick the Rebs either. Did you ever think of that? Why is it he ain't freed the slaves? Is he afeard of hurting the feelings of some of his women kinfolk down in Kentucky? Why does he put up with his no account that's running the Army of the Potomac? Does he like seeing Bobby Lee run us over? I got a lot of questions about old Abe that I'd like an answer to. Your doubts ain't gonna make me down on old Abe, Tom, Israel Thomas answered angrily. Things is tough right now, but this war is a big thing. It's middling easy for us farmers and the big editors and the abolitionist preachers to run the job of being president. Old Abe is doing all he can do, I say, and for him, and I'm for him all the way. One of the men took a drink from the water jug Jethro had brought up to the workers, and handing it back, he rumpled the boy's hair with rough affection. Be glad you're a boy, young feller, and don't have to pester yourselves with all these troubles that men be suffering through these days, he said genially. Jethro had picked up a mannerism from his mother. He closed his eyes briefly, as if to hide from the world the exasperation with which the man's words struck him. He knew he must keep quiet. These men were kind, generous men, and anyway, the boy had no right to contradict a man's opinion. If they wished to think of him as an ignorant child, he must not try to change their idea of him. But it was a bitter dose to swallow. A few days after the barn raising, a letter came from Shadrach Yale, in which he too discussed General McClellan from the viewpoint of a young soldier who had just known his first experience under fire. Antietam had been the baptismal battle for the young schoolteacher, and the letter to Jenny reflected the agony of a man new to the scenes of death and suffering. This time, Jenny read the letter in its entirety to the family, and then she quietly passed it to her father and to Jethro for rereading. The words of love that interspersed those of mental anguish were not ones that a silly girl blushed over and hoarded to herself. There was a new dignity about Jenny after that letter from Antietam. Of General McClellan, Shadrach wrote, "I've never known men of my age, and many much older, who have so completely worshipped another man. They may be hungry, wounded, heartsick at the death of comrades, but they forget everything when they see him, and they break into cheers as if this hero had brought them nothing but pure joy. They accept suffering of any kind as something through which they can show their devotion to this leader. You've probably read of the disorganization and discouragement of this army after General Pope's defeat at Bull Run. It took only the sight of this small, handsome man, McClellan, dashing up and down the lines on horseback to restore confidence and courage. He shouted, waved his cap, encouraged by their cheers, and fired his men with the kind of spirit that they showed here at Antietam. The men resent those of us who have not known him long, the ones who are silent when they cheer. I believe that a word against him might be as dangerous to the one who spoke it as a rebel bullet would be. They will not believe that he has ever been anything but right. They revile the president when rumors of his impatience with their general get around. I tell you frankly that the contagion of their devotion has not yet gripped me. I do not dislike him. I believe that he is personally brave and devoted to the cause for which his men are fighting. But he is afraid of something, of sending men who love him to their death, of making an error that will reflect upon the image of himself which he knows to exist in the minds of his men. He does not have the cold approach to killing, the singleness of purpose, the brutal tenacity that the winner of this war, if there ever is to be one, must have. The autumn months approached the end of the year in gloom. Fields of green corn turned yellow, and the leaves, withered during the frosty nights, rattled as if in protest as Jethro drove his wagon down the rows and piled it high with full golden ears. Antietam was over, a name for future history books, and a battle at which men in later years, blessed with the advantage of hindsight, would wonder. Jethro, in his manhood, would learn of the incompetence, the blindness, and the ghastly waste of life that followed a lost opportunity. In the autumn of 62, he only knew that Antietam seemed much like Shiloh, a federal victory in which one was hard put to find a step toward a final triumph and peace. The career of General McClellan was almost over, too. It would rise with another spurt later on, but that fall the papers blazed with the news that the president had relieved the general of his command. And the name that had outshone all others now plummeted into near obscurity. Now another man dominated the headlines briefly, very briefly. The new name was that of Ambrose Burnside. In December, Jethro looked for another river and another town in Shadrach's atlas. The river was the Rappahannock in Virginia. A little town lying on the river was Fredericksburg. The stories of the battle were ones that brought despair to the North. Fredericksburg had been undertaken with little probability of success, the papers claimed. Nothing could have been expected under the shabby plans, if indeed they were plans, other than appalling slaughter. But Burnside was a stubborn man. determined perhaps to show action and competence where McClellan had shown hesitancy and uncertainty. Wave after wave of men were sent up the slopes of a chain of hills from the tops of which the entrenched Confederates mowed the Federals down until the ground was piled high with blue-clad bodies. Rumor was that this general, far back from the line of battle, had insisted that still more divisions be sent up the deadly hills, but that he was finally dissuaded by officers of lower rank and keener perception. Shadrach must have been at Fredericksburg. There could be little doubt of it. The family waited for days, during which Jethro's waking thoughts were filled with foreboding and his dreams with troubled anxiety. Jenny went about her work silently, and although there was work enough to tire the healthiest of young bodies, she took to going for long walks alone through the wintry fields, as Bill had once done. There was nothing one could say to comfort her. Finally, a letter came, word from Shadrach that he was safe. He wrote, "It is unfortunate that congressmen and their ladies should have been deprived of this spectacle. There was drama here, I can tell them. Thousands upon thousands of us crossing the Rappahannock with banners flying, drums rolling, and our instruments of death gleaming in the sunlight. They could have seen those thousands scrambling up the innocent-looking wooded hills and falling like toy soldiers brushed over by a child's hand. Thousands of young men whose dreams and hopes were snuffed out in a second, and who will be remembered only as simple soldiers who fell in a cruel, futile battle directed by men who can hardly be called less than murderers. I should not like to live with Ambrose Burnside's thoughts, though one wonders if his conscience is not protected by a thick covering of stubborn self-righteousness. Need I say that the men in the Army of the Potomac do not cheer General Burnside? In Tennessee, there was a place called Stone's River. John was there, and in the early days of 1863, he wrote to Nancy of what had happened in the battle. He wrote of a commander named Rosecrans, Old Rosie, the men called him, who had repulsed Van Dorn, the Van Dorn of Pea Ridge, Jethro thought, when the Confederates attempted to take Corinth, and had later replaced Don Carlos Buell, when Buell, too much the McClellan type of general, had been relieved of his command. John wrote of bitter cold and suffering that had finally ended with a victory of sorts, when the Confederate General Bragg had left in full retreat, stopped short in his move toward Kentucky. Stone's River was a victory, but there were 13,000 casualties, and John wrote wearily, "The suffering and scenes of death was such as to make a man's heart hate war." Fredericksburg and Stone's River, the stories of these two battles filled the papers during the last days of 1862 and the early ones of 1863. Everyone was discouraged, and it looked as if the war might never be won, as if, indeed, the country that had been born in the travail of revolution and had been given direction during the days of 1787, when the Constitution came to life, might now be dissolved into two weak nations. Well, why not? The soldiers were beginning to say. How much can men bear to keep together the nation their great-grandfathers helped to create? They were losing faith in their leaders and in the cause of the Union. In the late winter of 1862, deserters began pouring back into Illinois. Thousands of young men had become disillusioned. This war was no breakfast spell.